Hi, this is Brahmachine, and I'm here to talk to you about a big problem on the internet. It's called white people. No, it's called the Gravel Institute. Imagine a stream of angry, ill-informed leftists that pours into every computer in America. Imagine it's disguised to look unbiased and packaged in slick videos with PhDs narrating. Imagine a donation-funded corporation that doesn't tell you how much they make in donations each year. No, I'm serious. I've looked for this and I can't find it anywhere. Well, that's the Gravel Institute. And the thing is, it works. 1 out of every 1 Twitter socialist has seen one of their videos, and 100% say they already agreed with it. Well, that's about to stop. Well, that very melodramatic introduction aside, I think this video is actually a bit harder because I agree with like 85–90% of the political objectives of the Gravel Institute. But roaming the internet as I do, I occasionally come across some odd Gravel Institute video, and something always bothers me that I haven't been able to put my finger on. Well, everything's come to a head now with the situation with Russia and Ukraine, and we've seen a lot of bad takes, which just adds to the sea of other older, terrible takes. So today, inspired by Big Joel's video on PragerU, I thought we would do a deep dive into the Gravel Institute and do some analysis of their videos, see what makes them tick and what that can tell us about their political conclusions. For those of you who don't know what the Gravel Institute is, let me give you a brief introduction. Now, reading off its Wikipedia, as you'll see I do a lot in this video, the Gravel Institute is a left-wing activist organization that creates YouTube videos. It markets itself as the left-wing alternative to PragerU, but as you'll see, perhaps it took that a little bit too much to heart. Oh, for those of you who don't know what PragerU is, imagine like 5-minute propaganda videos with very, very cute animations that are trying to tell you that poor people just don't deserve to have food. Okay, now the left-wing version of that, that's the Gravel Institute. To start off with, I figured we'd watch Is Big Government the Problem? Featuring Brianna Joy Gray. This video is important because it's something of a foundational text for the channel. They're most clear in their objectives and their political beliefs here, and if you understand this video, it goes a long way towards understanding all of the other videos that I'm going to present. As I said earlier, I agree with the vast majority of this video, but where I start to take issue is when they explain why big government is not working for Americans. Let's take a look at that now. Joy Gray begins by citing the infamous 2014 Gillens and Page study as the academic consensus.
The reason it feels like our politicians don't work for us is because, well, they don't. Republicans and Democrats alike are working for the people who line their wallets instead. That's not just my politics. That's the academic consensus. In 2014, a Princeton University study found that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy. More than that, they found that the desires of regular people have zero impact on policy adoption. Not a little impact, not barely any impact, no relationship at all.
So they immediately recognize in the description of the video that it's actually a very controversial study.
Academic consensus.
Controversial study.
Academic consensus.
Well, since this is the issue in question, I figured we would do a bit of a deep dive into the rebuttals and responses given to the Gillens and Page study. The first critique of this study focuses on the subset of issues where the middle class and the upper class disagree. It is found that among these issues, about 50% are resolved in favor of the middle class and 50% in favor of the upper class. If we expected that the upper class controlled everything, then why would they only get their way about 50% of the time? Luckily for the Gravel Institute, the original authors of the paper have a response to this critique. They say that the definition of supported by the upper and middle class is problematic. Because the definition of supported is just 50% plus 1 in polling data, that means that you could have issues that are supported by the middle class 51% or 99%, and they would be coded the same way. Rather, they propose you should have a more politically important measure of support being 75% or more support. If you look at this set of data, the rich actually get their way far more than the middle class. But notice it's vulnerable to the exact same objection they just raised. If they define support as 75% or more, then couldn't it just be that when rich people support something 76%, middle class people support it 74% and are still in favor? This is just always the problem with having a dichotomy on a continuous variable. So the fact that Gillens and Page criticize the rebuttal for having that, but then propose the exact same methodology with the same flaws to vindicate their study, it's pretty weak evidence. But I also think there are other more damning critiques of the study. One of the most damning is looking at the R-squared. This is a measure of how much one thing affects another in a dataset. In other words, it quantifies the explanatory power of certain things. For example, in this study, the ability of the rich to do whatever they want. Now, you might be surprised to hear that the R-squared of this study is actually 0.074. That is to say that the rich controlling every politician, as the Gravel Institute would like you to believe, actually explains about 7.4% of policy variation. Not exactly very impressive, is it? Now, Gillens and Page and I would both defend the claim that the rich have disproportionate amounts of power in our political system, but it's just dishonest to frame this as them controlling every politician, especially given the amount of academic dispute over the subject. Next, I'd like to make a small note. This isn't a big deal, but I do think that it also shows kind of mild dishonesty at play in this video. The Gravel Institute compares a 91% top marginal tax rate and then a 23.5% effective tax rate today to show that the rich are taxed much less. If you look at the top effective tax rate and the current effective tax rate, the difference is still large, but much smaller than 91% to 23.5%. In this discussion of tax rates, they heavily imply that the reason taxes are lower now is basically because of the influence of the elites. Now, here comes the first section of the Brown Machine, how this video should have been. I'll be reading a few sections of a Gallup article, which uses polling of the average American, to explain why raising taxes on the rich has not happened. To begin, it is true that, quote, far more Americans continue to say they are bothered a lot by the feeling that some corporations and wealthy people do not pay their fair share of taxes than by the complexity of the tax system or even the amount they pay in taxes. But at the same time, quote, it is hard to find evidence that reducing inequality is a top priority for Americans. Concern about income inequality, or for that matter, worry that taxes on the wealthy are not high enough, rarely shows up in Gallup's monthly updates on the most important problems facing the nation. In Gallup's May update, to cite the most recent example, only 2% of Americans mention the gap between the rich and the poor as the biggest problem facing the nation. Furthermore, there's evidence that people don't always want the government to act. Again, quoting the article, quote, Americans are not at all enthusiastic about the idea of government interventions in the economic system. This is partially because not all Americans are enthusiastic about the government in general. For example, our annual update on views of governance last fall showed that while 83% of Democrats wanted the government to do more to solve the nation's problems, only 22% of Republicans agree. So to summarize, yes, people generally want taxes raised on the rich, but no, it's not a priority political issue for most people, and therefore it usually doesn't decide elections. The reason they haven't been raised isn't because wealthy people control everything, it's because the average voter has other things on their mind. Lastly, I'd like to make a little general point about how we know that the rich don't control everything. It's the increase in social spending across almost all developed countries in the last 100 years. Even in the US, we see much the same. There was very little social spending as a percent of GDP in the early 1900s, and that has climbed a lot to 2000 and beyond. Now, if you look at the definition of social spending, it's not tax cuts for the rich or subsidies for oil billionaires. It's things like old age pensions and healthcare that middle or lower class people probably need, but the rich barely use. If the rich controlled everything, why would they just give their money away for services that they're not really the main recipients of? But if we take a step back from this video, and we look at the big picture, ignoring all of the individual factual inaccuracies and bad arguments, what do we see? They say, big government is not the problem, big government does good things for people, which I agree. And the reason it's not doing those things for people now is because there's an elite that controls the government effectively. Throughout the course of this video, we'll look at how that ideology affects and infects other analyses that the Gravel Institute engages in. Alright then, the next video up is a Gravel Institute short titled, Why Do People Go Hungry? This video shows that there's plenty of food to feed everyone in the world, just that there's a lot of waste too, and therefore some people go hungry. True, but not at all surprising. Where the video does get kind of interesting is when they explain why this is.
People experience hunger or food insecurity. If there's no shortage of food, how can this be? Blame capitalism. 10 greedy companies control and profit off of nearly all food production across the globe.
Now, unfortunately, I have no idea where they get this list of 10 companies or the fact that they control the world, because as far as I can tell, the video has no sources. But from some extensive research I've done myself and getting out of my comfort zone and doing some big maths, I found that the top 10 companies, in terms of market cap, that is the proportion of the total financial value of all stocks in the sector, represented by those 10 companies, is about 56%. A lot, hardly omnipotent. Similarly, if you look at the share of total revenue, that is the portion of the total amount of money made in food, represented by the top 10 companies, that would be about 12.9%. This isn't anywhere near a majority, much less almost all. Now, to be fair, if you look at specific types of food, for example meats, you might be able to find the top 4 companies own something like 80% of the market. But keep in mind that that's not what the Gravel Institute is saying, or what they need to say for their argument to make sense. People don't go hungry because they're cornered out of the cereal market. People go hungry because they're out of the food market. And if there's no monopoly or oligopoly in the food market, then the market is functioning. Now we come to part 2, in Bra Machine explains how this video should have been. Luckily, there's already lots of literature on why food insecurity still exists even in developed countries. The simple answer is because of wealth inequality and lack of government assistance. The government should be doing more to ensure that people have healthy and well-balanced diets. But I can't seem to find anywhere, and I've looked, that the problem is 10 big companies control all of food production. And you know why that is? It's because it isn't true. But you know what? That's a lot less sexy and anti-capitalist to say. The third video I'll subject you to, or okay, actually it's not that bad, but the third video we'll watch together is called What the Monopoly Man Won't Tell You. It's another short. This is really about the origin of monopoly and how it shows that evil big corporations want to censor any anti-capitalist message that reaches their doorstep.
Left-wing activist Lizzie Magie patented the landlord's game in 1904. It had 2 sets of rules: the monopolist rules, which worked like the game we know today, and the prosperity rules, where every player got a piece of money from rent, not just the person who owns it. The point was to play both versions to learn how all members of society could prosper with a more equal system, instead of one greedy person hoarding all the wealth and leaving everyone else bankrupt. Parker Brothers bought Maggie's patent for just $500. Maggie hoped they'd spread her anti-capitalist message. Instead, they spread only the monopolist message that stockpiling money is somehow a good thing.
But, of course, again, it's not really true. A brief timeline of the events that you can find on Wikipedia, which as your average keyboard warrior I am going to cite, has the game being created in 1903 with a set of rules that Gravel Institute describes. Now, the Parker brothers were approached with this game multiple times, but they kept rejecting it because it wasn't popular enough or they thought it would take too long to play. In any case, by 1910, it had become quite a popular game in certain communities, but the second set of rules had already been dropped in favor of just the first competitive round of play that we play nowadays. Then finally in 1935, much later on, someone other than the original creator finally sold it to Parker Brothers, stating that it had originally been their game. By this time, the game had already been played for about 25 years without the second set of so-called prosperity rules. Okay, part 3 of Bra Machine says how this video should have been. It just shouldn't. It just shouldn't exist. Don't make it. Now that I've gone after the most petty possible example of a fault in a Gravel Institute video, it's probably worth going over why all of this matters anyway. I mean, it's not like this is the New York Times, right? We can't expect them to get everything factually right all the time. But they do seem to be a fairly well-produced organization with lots of staff and a fair number of donations, and so they should be able to do the basic research that me, as somebody without a job, sitting in a closet full of pillows, can do. I think the basic questions we should ask ourselves is this: if the Gravel Institute is somebody's main source, or even one of their major sources of political engagement, would they walk away understanding how the world works? And the answer is absolutely no. They would think that 10 corporations are responsible for global hunger. Untrue. They would think that the rich control all of politics. Untrue. And they would think that Parker Brothers is an evil, terrible corporation that took away the entire political activism in monopoly. Also untrue. And this next video is where that lack of understanding really comes to the fore. This video is called How America's Best State Fell Apart, featuring Philip Rocco. It details the fall of Wisconsin from a social democratic paradise to a darling of Republicans nationwide. The video makes non-stop good points about unionization and wage stagnation, and also about heavy gerrymandering, which is evident in Wisconsin. But of course what we should really look at here is their explanation for why each political decision was made. To begin with, what's worthy of note here is that they give the first sociological analysis for why policies become a certain way. They explain the relatively left-wing policies of prior Wisconsin governments with reference to the values and institutions of the average person.
The German and Scandinavian immigrants who came to Wisconsin in the 19th century brought with them communitarian ideas. They had an emphasis on collective solidarity over individual success. Wisconsinites displayed a remarkably durable social fabric built on strong communal ties, vigorous labor unions, and a deeply democratic and egalitarian worldview.
But on the other hand, when presenting Scott Walker, they say things like this.
The new governor was a conservative named Scott Walker. Walker was very different from early generations who had defined Wisconsin. He liked to play up his blue-collar credentials and occasionally drove a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. But beneath the facade, the new governor was an agent of the wealthy elites, and he saw his time as governor as an opportunity to put their worldviews into practice.
And of course failed to mention any analysis to do with the average person's opinions on the issues which he championed. The infamous and I think terrible right-to-work laws that he passed were actually supported about 62% by Wisconsinites, or 69% in another poll. Clearly these were popular policies. Now I'm not qualified to give an explanation for why Wisconsinites had these new policy preferences, but suffice it to say that the Gravel Institute didn't even try, instead describing Scott Walker as an agent of the wealthy elites only. Again, when we reflect back and look at what this video says about the Gravel Institute as a whole, another truth becomes evident. The Gravel Institute isn't always allergic to sociological analysis, they're just mostly allergic when it would imply that people don't agree with them. As you'll notice in this video, when the policies are the policies that the Gravel Institute likes, they're more than happy to explain why the people supported them too. When the Gravel Institute disagrees with policies, it's convenient fiction that the rich people control all politicians. Why would they want that? Well, simply put, everybody else already agrees with us and you just have to join is a lot more attractive message than about 50 or 60% of the population disagrees with our video, but we're going to explain why it's important anyway. Of course, the Gravel Institute wants to make it seem like their positions are very common, and the only reason there's any deviation is because of wealthy elites. They would lose their power to implicitly appeal to the vague majority if it's clear that the vague majority already made a decision they disagree with. Armed with all of this new insight into the Gravel Institute's biases and ideology, I think that we should take a look back at the Ukraine video I alluded to at the very beginning. This video was originally titled something about Ukraine's neo-Nazi problem, but now after facing a great deal of much-deserved public backlash, they changed the name to America, Russia, and Ukraine's far right. Before we begin analyzing though, I think it's worth mentioning that, as has been said before, emphasis is one of the best tools of propaganda. This video gets a few things totally wrong, but mostly they just fail to mention things that are inconvenient for their narrative, while going to great lengths to find facts that support it. Alright then, let's really get in there and go at it.
We have to look at a crucial figure in Ukrainian nationalist history, a guy named Stepan Bandera. You see, in the 1930s and 40s, Bandera wanted Ukrainian independence from Poland and the Soviet Union. So when the Nazis invaded, Bandera allied with them. His followers massacred huge numbers of Poles and Jews. But in spite of this legacy, Bandera is still viewed as a hero in the west of Ukraine. There are Stepan Bandera streets, museums, and monuments. In 2010, Bandera was even named an official hero of Ukraine.
The fact is that support for Stefan Bandera is a lot more complicated than they described. Although there are some areas where he is very popular, quote, he is considered in surveys of Ukraine as a whole among the 3 historical figures who produce the most negative attitudes. Even in the West in certain regions, for example in Volhynia, oh no that's not, wait a second.
Volhynia.
5% had a very positive opinion, 20% a mostly positive opinion, 57% were neutral, 7% were mostly negative, 5% were very negative, and 6% were unsure. Similarly for, I wouldn't even try for this one,
Transcarpathia.
4% were very positive, 32% were mostly positive, 50% were neutral, none had a mostly negative opinion, 7 had a very negative opinion, and 7% were unsure. Overall though, according to some polls, a positive attitude prevails in the western regions of Ukraine, with 70% saying they think positively of Bandera. Similarly, if you look at him being named Hero of Ukraine, that is strictly true but very misleading. Soon thereafter, this naming was revoked because he was not officially a Ukrainian citizen. When reaffirming his status as Hero of Ukraine was proposed in 2019, it failed to pass through Parliament. Amazing what you can do just by reading Wikipedia, isn't it?
By early 2014, the government lost the ability to control the protests.
In a rapidly evolving political crisis, President Yanukovych has been voted out by Parliament, forced to leave Kiev.
And the US recognized interim government that replaced him had a significant far-right faction. The Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, and others were all from that far-right party, Svoboda. And this led to backlash in the East, because Eastern Ukrainians were horrified at what they saw as a far-right seizure of power.
Now, if we look at the interim government they talk about, they conveniently failed to mention the fact that it only existed for 8 months, late February to late October. And in fact, the very far-right party, Svoboda, exited the coalition only 5 months after the start of the interim government in late June. Then in the October 2014 Ukrainian election, Svoboda and Right Sector together won 7 seats out of a total of 450 seats available in the Ukrainian parliament, which became 1 seat in 2019. Of course, none of these electoral results are mentioned because that would all be too nuanced and show that the far-right barely exists in parliament at this point.
In the eastern peninsula of Crimea, people were furious. Many of them talked about joining Russia, so the Russian government saw an opportunity. They wanted to encourage a surge of Russian nationalism for its own benefit. So Russia annexed Crimea and held a disputed referendum to legitimize the decision.
As many as 95.5% of the electorate in Crimea have voted to join Russia. We are going back home. Crimea is in Russia.
Energized by the annexation and supported by Russian armed and military personnel, the anti-government protests became a full-blown secessionist movement. Eastern provinces like Donetsk and Luhansk held separatist referendums and declared independence.
These referendums they mention are also a little more complicated than portrayed. It's true that the result of the referendum in Crimea was probably what would have happened under a free and fair referendum anyway. After all, there's lots of polling from many organizations, for example from the UN, showing that a vast majority of Crimeans wanted to leave and join Russia for many years prior to the Russian invasion of Crimea. Though to be fair, could you imagine the Gravel Institute calling it a just contested referendum if the US ruled into a part of Mexico and said that that part voted to join the US? On the other hand, the referendums in Donbass were a totally different story. The clear majority of residents were in favor of remaining part of Ukraine either under a more federalized system or under the current one, with a small minority in favor of secession and joining Russia. This effect was even more pronounced when looking at the general eastern Ukrainian region rather than just the Donbass. And on the actual day of the referendum, there's good evidence that people who would have voted against just abstained as a protest because they thought that it was a corrupt referendum. This is evidenced by the about 32% turnout estimated by the Central Ukrainian authorities. Great, the next topic is the Azov Battalion, which I just love hearing about every single second I'm on Twitter.
So a new paramilitary emerged. It was called the Azov Battalion. And unlike the official Ukrainian military, Azov's volunteers were willing to go the distance. But Azov wasn't just any random organization. It was a pretty disturbing far-right group. It had come out of neo-Nazi street gangs that had been used as muscle by Ukrainian elites in the 90s and 2000s. Azov members regularly sported tattoos of swastikas. Their symbol was based on a Nazi emblem. Their leader declared that their mission was to, quote, lead the white races of the world in a final crusade against the Semite-led Untermenschen, subhumans. But Azov's neo-Nazism turned out not to be such a huge concern to the Ukrainian government, because in 2014, a guy named Arsen Avakov became interior minister in charge of police and security. And Avakov had been a longtime patron of the neo-Nazi gangs. And when he was a regional governor, he used them as enforcers. So when he became interior minister, Avakov had the Azov battalion incorporated into Ukraine's National Guard. Ukraine is the only country to have a neo-Nazi formation in its military.
So it's worth noting the actual size of the Azov battalion, which the Gravel Institute definitely does not do. Current estimates are that there are about 900 members of the Azov battalion, and about 10 to 20% of them are Nazis, which gives us about 90 to 180 Nazis. If you ask me, that's 90 to 180 Nazis too many, especially to have in your armed forces. But by no means is it at all representative of the wider Ukrainian army, consisting of about 200,000 people. And to be fair, I expect a government fighting existential wars to turn to some unsavory people for help. So is it true that Ukraine is the only country with an official neo-Nazi formation in their army? I think we'll have to let the Gravel Institute off on a technicality here. Technically, the Wagner Group is a private contracting group, but in actuality, it is a neo-Nazi group with very close ties to the Russian security apparatus, who is funded by a Russian oligarch with close ties to Putin. Clearly, it's not just an independent fighting force that Russia happens to use. Wherever it goes, it's closely tied with Russian geopolitical interests. So here's a picture of Dmitry Utkin, the leader of the Wagner Group. Don't you just want him to tuck you into bed? You can see on his chest there are many Nazi symbols, and there's good evidence that he has Nazi sympathies and idolizes Hitler. Clearly also a neo-Nazi group here, with, might I mention, 6,000 people instead of 900. You'd think that this would be a particularly relevant example, because it's actually the country that Ukraine is actively engaged in war with right now. But again, the Gravel Institute wants to focus on Ukraine, so we'll just forget about things like that.
And in 2021, the United States and Ukraine were the only two countries to vote against a UN resolution condemning the glorification of Nazism.
Don't worry, we're almost done here, but let's just take a look at this resolution. First of all, take a look at the authors. Not to spoil anything, but they might belong to a certain bloc. Countries like Belarus, Russia, and Venezuela might have an interest in emphasizing the Nazi issue in Ukraine. Almost like this video is. Though of course there are some legitimate criticisms to be made, blah blah blah. Anyway, the resolution also includes some passages like this one. Emphasizes the recommendation of the Special Rapporteur that any commemorative celebration of the Nazi regime, its allies, and related organizations, whether official or unofficial, should be prohibited by states. I mean, of course, language like that contradicts some American principles of very liberal freedom of assembly. And in fact, if you look at all of the abstentions, you'd find all of the EU abstaining in addition to New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. I don't think that all of these countries are neo-Nazi. So yeah, a vote against this resolution may be a bad thing. Does it really say anything about a country's political leanings? Not that much. Now that I've broken down the individual factual inaccuracies and misrepresentations, you might be thinking, well, Brumachine, this has nothing to do with what you were talking about before, to do with Gravel Institute's ideology and biases. And now's the part where I do my best to make it seem like I actually had a cohesive idea for a video essay, rather than having one idea and then being angry about the Ukraine video. So the most obvious example of this ideology that unsavory things must be caused by a small evil group rather than a mass of uninformed or misinformed people is the Maidan protests, which the video says are largely spurred forward and maintained by radical right groups. But there are other places where this ideology pops up. For example, in the idea that the information they're sharing is some type of privileged and secretive information. It's not. But that would make sense if you think that US state policy is run by a few wealthy people with access to information that we don't have. But I think if you look a layer deeper, you actually find that the entire structure of the video is based around this ideology. Gravel can't accept that Ukraine is run by regular political forces with marginal groups all vying for power. Rather, there has to be a puppet master behind the curtain, and in this case, it's neo-Nazis. Now, a little disclaimer here. In the video itself, the presenter says that Ukraine is not run by neo-Nazis, and in the comments, the Gravel Institute makes clear that they think this is only part of a larger conflict. But if you look at the text as a whole, I think it's clearly pointing in the opposite direction. They might not explicitly say that all of Ukraine is run by neo-Nazis, but the fact that they include so many marginal political figures to make a point while omitting some pretty clear realities that I just pointed out paints a different story. There's some mixed metaphors for you. Anyway, it's disappointing to see a group that I had a lot of hope for, and I'm sure a lot of others did too, make some bad and misleading videos, but I think there is still hope. Emma Viglin's Why Didn't America Become a Socialist Country is a great example of this. It's one of their only videos where there's a complex sociological analysis applied to why America is not the way they want it to be. In short, Emma shows that the left has failed in America, not just because of government repression, but also because of inherent economic and social realities. This is exactly the type of thing that the left needs if it's going to win. We need to understand why we failed so far. Not because there are a few rich people who control everything, but because we haven't convinced many Americans to let us control anything. Anyway, now I have to end this video as dramatically as it began. As Nietzsche famously said when he was referring to the Gravel Institute and PragerU, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster." Or I guess just a bad YouTube channel. Okay, no Patreon question of the day today because nobody decided to give me money. Instead, you can follow my YouTube channel or go to my Twitter to find some very entertaining tweets. Bye!